Chapter 15 Hiding in Wait. Zeddy and Zadie sat crammed into the big empty metal supply cabinets in the laboratory. They were very scared. Zeddy was almost too terrified to breathe, but he thought maybe that was good since he didn't want to make a single sound. Zadie sat across from him in the dark cabinet, silent. Zeddy thought his mother must have been very uncomfortable in the cabinet. Luckily, she was only a little over 5 feet tall and thin, otherwise she would never have fit. Still, she had to feel awkward and uncomfortable stuffed in the cabinet. He even felt cramped, as small as he was. Outside the cabinet they could hear the knocking again, and again. There were muffled voices for a few moments, and what sounded like a door shutting. Minutes passed, but each one felt like a year. Zeddy and Zadie sat like statues in the cabinet. The little Zutterfly's red glow of warning grew darker and darker, until at last the Zutterfly turned black. As the petrified mother and son watched the Zutterfly disappear into the blackness of the cabinet, they heard the door open and shut again. Then they heard the deep, booming voice. Zeddy had never been so afraid. He closed his eyes tight and clenched his lips together in hopes that no sound would escape. Escape. Zeddy's mind raced at the thought of the word escape. How? When? Where? His mind seemed to be spinning in circles of glowing red against the black of his closed eyelids. The voices in the front of the house seemed to fade. All he could hear was the constant thumping of blood surging through his heart and speeding through his body. The stale air in the cabinet felt like it was sucking the oxygen out of his lungs rather than bringing it into them. Zeddy was worried. What if the police took Prophecy? What if they took them all? As Zeddy's mind spun and spun, he suddenly remembered their duffel bags left in the hall near the front door. Oh no, if the IMP saw the duffel bags, then it would be over. Zeddy thought as hard as he could for a way to keep the IMP from discovering their bags. Maybe he could sneak out of the cabinet and down the hall to get the bags and hide them. He looked anxiously at the dark shape of his mother, wishing she could hear what he was thinking. He had to do something. The muffled voices were still there. If he didn't act soon, they might get caught. Zeddy tried to see Smalley, but the danger must still have been high because the little Zutterfly was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't as if something as tiny as the Zutterfly could move the bags. Zeddy would have to do it. He would have to save them from the IMP. Zeddy reached up to push the cabinet door open. Zadie saw his movement, but in the sliver of dim light she saw Zeddy shaking his head. Zadie was so confused. What was Zeddy trying to do? He was sure to be caught if he opened the cabinet. Zadie reached over and grabbed Zeddy's arms, letting the cabinet door fall silently shut. Zeddy whispered as quietly as possible, "Mom, we left our bags in the hall. If the IMP noticed, they will definitely arrest Prophecy, and then they will come to find us. I have to go hide the bags." "No, Zeddy, you can't risk it," Zadie whispered frantically. "I have to do this, Mom," Zeddy whispered back. Zadie knew he was right. There was no way any of them were going to escape the IMP if they saw those duffel bags sitting in the hall. Zadie sadly nodded her agreement, although her heart was breaking. Zeddy nodded back. He was scared, but he knew he had to do what he could to save them. He reached up and pushed the cabinet door slowly open. He could hear the voices more clearly now. "So you are telling me that the explosion was just an accident. It seems more logical to us that you were trying to cover up an enormous blunder. The Nevada province is still in quarantine, and radiation from the nuclear reactor you were using has caused a tremendous amount of environmental damage. How does a nuclear reactor reach meltdown level without the person who designed the machine knowing it was happening? Why didn't you cut the reactor off and follow protocol? Why?" A deep voice was yelling in a room down the hall. "I told you! It all happened so fast that I didn't have time to follow protocol. I could save the life of my partner or follow protocol," Prophecy's raised voice bellowed back. Zeddy was shocked to hear the professor yelling. Prophecy was actually yelling at the International Military Police. That had to be who was here. The IMP was interrogating Prophecy about the explosion and the project, and Prophecy was yelling at them. He was the bravest man in Amerasia. Zeddy knew his father's stories were truthful on that account. Prophecy was more courageous than Zeddy had ever imagined, and his courage inspired Zeddy to be courageous too. Zeddy silently slipped out of the cabinet and shut the door, leaving his mother and Smalley inside. Slowly he stood up and peered around the room. It was then Zeddy remembered that he still had the Rosetta crystal in his hand. Zeddy opened his hand, and glimmering in the darkened crystal was Numue's golden eyes. "Young Zeddy, in your hand you hold the key to the problem you face. Only you can unleash its power. Now is the time. You know how. You all must escape. In my crystal viewer I have seen your father's face glimmering in a place called Jungle Island. You must get there and find him. You will know what to do." Nimue's voice echoed in his head. He looked around, but no one must have heard her voice but him. The IMP were still arguing with the professor in a room down the hall. The crystal must have allowed Nimue to speak to him in his mind. He wondered if he could ask her a question the same way. Now, however, was not the time to find out whether or not he could. He had to move those bags from the hall. Is that what the crystal was going to help him do? Move the bags? But how? As Eddie stood there frozen in thought, he was jolted back into reality as he heard the deep voice bellowing. "So if all this was an accident, then why are your bags packed? Where were you going, Professor? Where?"